Hello and welcome everyone to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. First of all, we would like to introduce Stephen. Stephen is a great American scientist, philosopher, and an artist. And today we have the topic space, the generality of place. And thank you all for joining us. And we would like to thank the US Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty team, and also thank you very much, Stephen, for having this event. And for you, audience, thank you for joining us. Please feel free to ask your questions, to give your comments. We would definitely answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aliyah, for the introduction. I would also like to thank the American Consulate in Almaty, Tracy, Elmira, Consul General Eric Meyer, for the opportunity to present a philosophical perspective on a broad range of topics. A lot of these talks focus upon philosophy itself. People that have been joining us on a regular basis know that I emphasize philosophical concepts like the epistemic, the nature of knowledge, the heuristic, the nature of problem solving. Tonight, we have a topic that is really more focused upon science, but that affords philosophical perspectives. And I'll be discussing philosophical perspectives on space, and human space flight. This talk is partly inspired by International Human Space Flight Day, and also in a few days, the anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's initial human space flight, which occurred 60 years ago. Later this afternoon, there will be a launch from Kazakhstan of an American astronaut and 2 Russian cosmonauts to the International Space Station. So that's another convergence that justifies this particular topic tonight, or tonight for me, in the morning for you. I mentioned last week that Sputnik had been an extraordinary event internationally, but was received in the United States with great trauma, that the Soviet Union had displayed such an advanced ability to launch a satellite into orbit before the United States was even capable of effectively controlling the launch of vehicles that would be able to transport a satellite into orbit. So space flight has been something that has really been a major influence upon my life, upon especially my early work in the sciences, and has been a continuing interest of mine. So again, I welcome the opportunity. A lot of this talk, though, is going to be focused upon some of the circumstances, and I'm going to be giving some anecdotes that made human spaceflight possible. And I'm going to be going back as far as Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and discussing some fascinating aspects of the history of the intellectual process that led to these achievements. First, though, last week's talk focused a little bit at the outset on baseball, because the American baseball season opened that day last week. What I didn't talk about at all was Easter, Christian Easter, that was celebrated, at least in the United States, last Sunday. I wanted to begin with that and then transition into space. And I have a means of achieving that transition. But I wanted to begin in acknowledgement of Easter, which is one of the most important of all religious observances, of any tradition. I wanted to acknowledge it with a poem, not one of mine, a poem by a celebrated English poet of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, A.E. Housman. The title of the poem is Easter Hymn, and I think I'll recite it and then say a few things about it. The narrator of the poem is addressing Jesus, addressing Christ on the occasion of Easter. The poem goes like this. If in that Syrian garden, ages slain, you sleep and know not you are dead in vain, nor even in dreams behold how dark and bright ascends in smoke and fire by day and night the hate you died to quench and could but fan. Sleep well and see no morning, Son of Man. But if the grave rent and the stone rolled by, on the right hand of majesty on high you sit, and sitting so, remember yet your tears, your agony and bloody sweat, your cross and passion and the life you gave. Bow hither out of heaven and see and save. That poem is in two stanzas. The first stanza is speculating that perhaps Jesus, according to the Christian system of belief, didn't rise from the dead. That he was perhaps, instead of being how Christianity views him, the Son of God, perhaps he was a man. And despite all of his efforts, he did not rise from the dead, does not embody, the full belief system that Christianity embraces. But if the Christian point of view is correct, and Jesus was in fact the Son of God, the poem is beseeching him to not wait any longer, but return to earth and save humanity. Right? It's a statement again of the desperation of human circumstance that motivates religious thinking. Right? We've talked about how Buddhism was motivated by disease, old age, and death, and the need for an immediate response to that. Christianity, the entire Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, is motivated by an attempt to restore in some way the conditions of Eden, right? To somehow undo or heal the fall of man, the fall of humankind, right? So, as I said, as I've emphasized too about philosophy, there's an aphorism that I've used before. Philosophy is singular, to answer the horror now and to the beginning and end of time with one question. Is our logic stronger than our pain? Right? So a lot of the philosophical enterprise, certainly a lot of the major religious enterprises throughout history have been focused on this issue of the need for some mode of salvation. And by salvation, we mean a complete solution to the problems of human life as they present themselves here and now, and independently of all possible future experience. Whenever I think of those circumstances, those issues, and in particular when I think of that poem, Easter Hymn, I think of a quotation by Oscar Wilde, another British writer, English writer. He was a poet, a playwright, a a novelist. He once wrote, "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." So that's, again, a transition, right, to this issue of space flight, space exploration. The idea that it provides, aside from appealing to human curiosity, to the need to find answers, find perspective, seeing things from a great height, a great distance provides perspective. And there's another aphorism of mine that relates. The stars, in metaphor or science, are possibilities of other worlds. So space represents an exploration of such possibilities. It also clearly represents one of the great human enterprises and one of the great human achievements. But aside from being a technological achievement, it's very much a conceptual achievement. It ultimately relies upon the creation of modern science, modern physics. So I wanted to address some interesting aspects of that development. In fact, when Apollo 11 was on its way to the moon, someone in mission control was asked by a television commentator that was covering the mission, who was guiding the spacecraft. Was it mission control? Was it the astronauts? Who actually was flying it, as it was in the middle of its journey to the moon? And the head of mission control responded, Isaac Newton. That's who's guiding the spacecraft. So I'd like to address some of those issues. The development begins with the Polish astronomer, Copernicus. It was Copernicus that first proposed in substantial terms the possibility that the Earth was not the center of, well, the solar system, but even more the center of existence. Rather, the sun was the center, as in Copernicus's astronomical theory, and the Earth was a planet moving around the sun. This was going to become one of the most controversial ideas ever proposed, because it meant that humanity was not quite at the center of the universe, as had been the prevailing belief since ancient times, and certainly throughout the Middle Ages, when the Christian church was a dominant influence on people's lives and people's thinking, especially in Europe. The notion of displacing humanity from the center of existence to being off-center and just another planet, right, was something that was seen as heretical, something that went against the fundamentals of Christian faith, Christian belief. Copernicus knew that he was treading on some really treacherous, waters when he was proposing this theory. And in fact, his major work, in which that astronomical perspective is developed, was presented to him in its final form for publication on his deathbed. So he would not have to, deal with the consequences of promulgating, of advancing, such a a radical notion that went against the fundamentals of Christian thinking. Okay? The person that did argue for and embrace, the Copernican view of the Earth moving around the sun was Galileo. Galileo was sometimes seen as really the beginning scientist of the development that leads to modern science and modern physics. It was Galileo who first began the process of doing experiments. There's that famous experiment that may or may not have actually been done, but it's certainly come down to us as one of the most celebrated experiments in the history of science. The time when Galileo supposedly went to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped two objects of different weight to demonstrate that they would land at the same time, which ran counter to the physics of Aristotle. Well, whether or not Galileo actually did that experiment, he did other experiments. He was one of the first persons to actually try to investigate laws of motion by experimentation, rather than just by thinking about the situation, about the circumstances. Galileo was also the first person to use a telescope on the heavens, to observe the sky. He observed the sun through the telescope. He saw sunspots for the first time, but it cost him his sight. He went blind eventually because presumably of that exposure, of his eyes, to the sun's intense light through a telescope. But Galileo embraced the Copernican view, wrote in defense of it, and argued for it strongly. He was committed to that system, of the world that had replaced the ancient view based on the work of an ancient astronomer, an ancient Greek astronomer, Ptolemy, that again had positioned the Earth at the center of existence. Galileo ran into conflict with the Catholic Church, and he was actually forced to recant his writings, his teachings about a sun-centered universe. He was sentenced to house arrest, where he lived out his life. He was blind and he was confined to his house. But when he signed the confession, the recanting, of his embrace of the Copernican, the sun-centered system of the world, he muttered under his breath, even as he signed the document, "E pur si muove." It's Italian for "and yet it moves." Now, when I was in high school, I actually had that written on my notebook that I carried around with me all the time on the cover of it. "E pur si muove." It was a demonstration of a commitment to truth over issues of belief or dogma. But Galileo actually was not quite right in maintaining so aggressively the view of a sun-centered world or sun-centered solar system, in that we now know, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, that the Einsteinian view is that any object is the still center, of the world, that the world can be described with the Earth at the center, with the sun at the center, with the moon at the center. If we go into space, and travel to Mars, while we are journeying, we are the center. the still center, according to the Einsteinian physics that would later emerge. But at the time, Galileo clearly got into serious trouble with the church. I wrote something about this. It's in poetic form. It's from the books of Joshua, which I've quoted from in the past. The books of Joshua is an autobiographical account of my intellectual development, also sort of emotional development. It's especially focused upon the development of like philosophical ideas, throughout the early part of my life. It's written basically in verse. You can think of it as a narrative poem or a novel in verse. There's one section that deals specifically with Galileo and his confrontation with the church. And it goes like this. And then after I recite it, I'll say a few things about it. Galileo claimed too much, as did the church, which likes to fuss, as did Galileo. And both would paint with too broad a brush. But the Talmud didn't rush and carefully considered why God delivered the 10 Commandments to a minor hill when a monumental majesty better fit the bill. And what did the scholars conclude? That God chose modesty over majesty because God inclines to humility. And so it need not mar creation that the race rides a minor planet, truth to tell, a carousel, around an otherwise undistinguished star, earning by circumference a dizzying sense of what we are. Now, I know that's a little bit dense, and it makes some references to things that may not be familiar. So let me explain exactly what that's saying and the point of it. The Talmud is Jewish commentary on the Old Testament. Okay? One of the issues that the Talmud specifically addressed was the question of why God gave Moses the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, where Mount Sinai is a relatively small, undistinguished mountain. It's not like the tallest, the most majestic in the area. Like, why did God deliver the most important communication that he was going to deliver to man, right? The laws by which human society should be constituted on such an undistinguished hill. The scholars of the Talmud were perplexed by this, and lots of arguments were advanced. But ultimately, the conclusion was that God prefers humility. God embraces humility. And so that was the significance of that delivery on Mount Sinai as a statement not just of the laws by which human society should be regulated, but a statement of the humility that God fundamentally embraces. Well, that argument, that justification would be the same justification for why having the earth in motion around the sun was not a fundamental violation of the nature of a Judeo-Christian and even Islamic universe. That if God was capable of giving the 10 Commandments on a minor hill, then God was capable of placing humanity on a minor planet. It's the same idea. So if if figures in the Christian church throughout the Middle Ages had been studying the Talmud They might have encountered that argument, that discussion, and when Copernicus, proposed his sun-centered, to replace an Earth-centered universe, and when Galileo defended it, there wasn't any inherent blasphemy, right, or heresy. There was another exemplification of God's embrace of humility that is central to the whole Christian tradition, even more central to the Christian tradition than it is to the Jewish tradition. So that discussion in the Talmud could have changed the course of history and made science, sort of accepted, much earlier, ultimately, than it was. But in any case, it was, Galileo's position to defend, a sun-centered universe a little too aggressively, right? But ultimately, the truth that Galileo thought he was advancing is not the truth that we live with today, right? Where, again, the truth that Einstein developed in his physics, comparable to what Heisenberg developed in quantum mechanics, is one infused by a philosophic perspective and a philosophic understanding that, as I've emphasized, we cannot leave the world to view it. We have to come to terms with the experience of this world from where we are inside existence, even though we imagine notions of reality as if we were seeing it from the outside. When we go to space, we're leaving this Earth behind, but we're not leaving existence behind, right? And that's the fundamental circumstance that we have to come to terms with philosophically, because it's the rigor of our circumstance. Just as Einstein and Heisenberg came to terms with it to develop a more powerful physics than Newton and Galileo had been able to achieve. Okay? Well, okay. Galileo's work was followed by the work of Kepler. Kepler was a mathematician who worked with and ultimately inherited all the observations, all the careful data of Tycho Brahe, a Danish astronomer who had the best astronomical equipment and observatory of the time. And he made very precise observations night after night of the positions of planets and stars. Using that data, Kepler spent 20 years trying to come up with a mathematical description of the motion of planets. And the most important result of that work was the idea that planets moved around the sun, not in circular orbits, as had been the belief ever since antiquity. In Ptolemy's account of a Earth-centered universe, planets and the sun and stars moved around the Earth in circular motions. Sometimes these circular motions had to be fairly complicated in order to account for the actual observed positions of planets and stars over time. And it gave rise to this elaborate system of circles upon circles of motion, so that there would be a major circle, and then there would be smaller circles that the planets would be moving on at the same time. Those are called epicycles, but not a simple account, of planetary motion. Kepler came along and in the course of 20 years of trying all types of different approaches to account mathematically and otherwise for the motions of the planets, finally developed his 3 laws of planetary motion. The most important of those laws is that planets move around the sun, not in circular orbits, but in ellipses, in ovals, right? Elongated orbits. That was a key to the development of physics and astronomy from that point forward. The major problem of the time, the major problem that was the key to unlocking Newtonian physics, the physics that would be ultimately responsible for guiding human beings to the moon, the ultimate question was, how could one explain elliptical orbits? There was discussion at the time that a law of gravitation, what's called an inverse square law of gravitation. An inverse square law is one that says if you, let's say, double the distance between 2 objects, 2 planets, to anything, you will decrease the force of attraction between those objects by 1/4. Okay, the force of attraction. So double the distance, the force of attraction becomes 1/4. The doubling squared 1/, an inverse squared law. Okay, people were speculating that that might be able to account for Kepler's laws of motion. But no one could really get beyond just that suggestion. There was a group of famous intellectuals who met one night at a pub in London. The 3 consisted of Robert Hooke, who was the president of the British Royal Society. It was the first major scientific society for advancing science. Christopher Wren was there. He was the architect, a prominent, one of the greatest architects in the history of England, certainly. He was responsible for the design of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. But, as many people of that time was dabbling in astronomy, was interested in it because it was a topic of conversation. And then Edmund Halley was the 3rd member of the group. Edmund Halley was a diplomat, very wealthy. He was also an amateur astronomer, and he had discovered Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet is named for Edmund Halley. It's a comet that is bright. It appears every, I think, 74 years, something of that order, and it had appeared, recently. And we're talking now maybe in the 1670s, maybe early 1680s. That's when this meeting occurred. And these 3 men got together and were discussing this basic problem of how we can explain Kepler's laws of motion. What can account for the universe as we seem now to be observing it? No one knew. There was the suggestion of the inverse square law, but no one knew exactly how that could explain what Kepler had discovered, right, mathematically. Somebody had suggested, though, it might have been Halley, that they remembered that some years earlier, a fellow, Newton, had come down from Cambridge, presented a telescope, a reflecting telescope that he had designed and built, and gave a little talk on a paper on optics, the nature of light. Newton was ridiculed, laughed at, because it turns out the ideas that he was promoting, advancing, ran counter to the ideas on the nature of light of Robert Hooke, who was the president of the World Society at the time, right? So Newton was not highly social, didn't do well with people. He was humiliated, he was angry, he was disgusted. He resolved never to publish results again, and he returned to Cambridge, not to be heard of, for 20 years, until this occasion, right? When these three men were together and Newton's name came up as someone who, was bright, seemed bright. Maybe he has some insight into the problem. So Halley undertook to go to Cambridge and speak with Newton. Being a diplomat, Halley was able to deal with people effectively, even someone with as difficult a personality as Newton's. Well, Halley comes to Newton. Newton greets him, and Halley, presents the issue, right? So, the major scientific question of the time was how to explain the laws of Kepler, how to explain why planets move in elliptical orbits. And so Halley asked Newton, if there's an inverse square law of gravitation, what kind of orbit would that produce in a planet moving around the sun? If the sun was attracting that planet with a force of gravity that operated according to, again, what's called an inverse square law. Halley asked Newton this, and Newton responds immediately, an ellipse. Halley is stunned. He asks Newton, how do you know this? How do you know that an inverse square force will produce an elliptical motion in a planet? Newton says, well, I proved it. Halley was like, again, he's having trouble believing what he's hearing, because this was the holy grail of what everybody was trying to come to terms with at that time. So, Halley says, well, can you show me the proof? Well, it was maybe 20 years earlier that Newton had actually done it. But he went through a little bit of a rigmarole with Halley, kind of pretended like he was looking for it, couldn't find it, and tells Halley, well, I'll have to find it or recreate it. And Halley said, well, please do this, because, this is potentially a result of the greatest significance, for science, for humanity. Well, Newton proceeded, in the course of the next few weeks or some period of time to do just that, to recreate the proof. He sent it to Halley. Halley undertook to guide Newton through the writing of the Principia, the book that created modern physics, the book that, again, was responsible for guiding Neil Armstrong and his crew to the moon on that Apollo 11 mission. The principles of that book were responsible for what was capable of taking Yuri Gagarin into orbit and sustaining his motion and guiding his motion in orbit around the Earth. It was Newton that explained everything that was at issue in making human spaceflight possible. Well, Halley not only guided Newton through the process of writing the Principia, he funded it, he financed it. It is Halley and his skill at, again, dealing with a difficult personality in Isaac Newton, who's ultimately responsible for modern science having been born as we understand, the Newtonian revolution of science. I want to show you something. Actually, let me show. I want to show it to you in a second. No, I'm going to show it to you right now. I have here a page from the Principia. Just wanted to show you one aspect of it. Notice now there's a lot of text, but there are also a lot of diagrams in it, like this, page after page of such diagrams. There's, you might be able to see diagram in text. It's a mathematical work. And I can show you page after page of such diagrams giving geometric reasoning in the development of the ideas of Newton's physics. Newton had developed calculus, but the world didn't know calculus at that point. Newton knew calculus because he had created it. Leibniz, the German mathematician, philosopher, had created it independently of Newton, but certainly at this point, it was not generally known, understood as a mathematical tool. So Newton was not able to develop the ideas of the Principia in the mathematics of calculus and have his work understood. So instead, he developed everything through Euclidean geometry, basic geometrical sort of diagrams and reasoning, as I've shown you, like one such diagram. Geometry, in other words, was decisive in the development of not just Newton's results, but in the creation of modern science, modern physics. So decisive that Newton, who again was not very social, he rarely socialized, he never married, he may never have dated. He mostly kept to himself and his work. And supposedly, he never was observed to have laughed in his lifetime in a social situation, except for once, when somebody came up to him and asked him what possible use geometry could be. Newton found that uproariously funny because geometry was at the center of the creation of modern physics, and again, of what made spaceflight ultimately possible. I have a story, an anecdote, that relates to that as well. And I just I'll tell it to you to just give you some additional points of view on this. I think I've mentioned that I do a lot of private teaching, one-on-one teaching, tutoring, in hundreds of different subjects. It's one of the things I do for like intellectual exercise, but it's also it has a social dimension for me. And a lot of my friends over the years have ended up being people that I had at one time taught or helped or tutored. There was a period of time when I would help people who were actors on television shows. They were not able to go to school because of the schedule that was involved in filming a television show. And so they would have, again, such a one-on-one instruction in small groups at the studios at which they would film. Some years ago, I was teaching two young actors. They were like 15 and 16, a boy and a girl, geometry, it turns out. And I'd given them an assignment to make some observations of the length of shadows that could be used to recreate a calculation that Eratosthenes, an ancient Greek astronomer, had used to compute a fairly accurate value for the circumference of the Earth, the distance around the Earth. Yes, the Earth was understood to be round even by ancient Greek astronomers and thinkers. Aristotle knew that the Earth was round because of the shape of eclipses, of the moon that the Earth's shadow would cast. So Eratosthenes had calculated the circumference of the Earth to something on the order of, he got a value of about 24,000 miles, which is very close to the modern exact value that we understand today. And I wanted these students to do the appropriate observations that would allow for that calculation. Well, they didn't. I went into class one day when they were supposed to have done it, and they didn't. And I was annoyed by that, right? Because we're talking geometry, right? And I've already shown you, how valuable geometry has been in the creation of what? Modern science, the world as we know it. So I made a comment. I said, I've seen the show. It was a situation comedy that they were working on, a weekly situation comedy. It didn't become successful, but a previous show by the same creator had become enormously successful. So, the people involved in this show had a lot of really success in television to them. So I made the comment, I've seen the show, geometry is more important. Well, they took exception to that. And in fact, one of the actors who became a very famous actor, at least in the United States, he's famous today. He's been in some very prominent television shows and films, but he went to the production staff, of the show and told them that comment I had made. They reacted, with anger. I wasn't there. I didn't see the reaction, but apparently the next day, I wasn't there the next day. I wasn't scheduled to teach, but I'd given them an assignment, a geometry assignment, and it required that some pages of a book be copied. This substitute teacher at one point went to make copies of this geometry book, and the crew, the people, and the cast, they're working on the show, saw this woman, with this geometry book and assumed she had been the one that was responsible for that comment, denigrating the show. And apparently there was a lot of hostility between the cast and this woman. It was an unfortunate encounter that she, had she wasn't responsible for it in the way that I was. Well, when I went to the studio the next day, I was asked to speak to an assistant director who had actually also gone to Harvard, and they thought that he would be somebody that would be able to communicate, their feelings about what I had said. He told me that, well, maybe you could apologize for that comment. So I went to the classroom. I told the two students I wasn't going to apologize, and instead I brought out a copy of the Principia that I had brought with me to show them the influence of geometry on not just modern science, but on everything they do. That cameras and all the technology involved in television production wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for the role of geometry in facilitating the creation of the Principia and modern physics, right? That it was a cornerstone of modern civilization. Well, some years later, I ran into that actor in a store one night, and he had changed dramatically. His attitude had softened, and he had matured, and he made reference to that encounter about geometry, and he said that those sessions were the most compelling classes he had ever had. So it's useful to stay aligned with one's sense of the truth of things, right? And one's sense of where value ultimately lies. That geometry was decisive for Newton. And again, the questioning of the value of geometry was the one thing that could evoke laughter from an otherwise very sort of serious, very stern human being. Okay. Let me see one thing here. 1 second. Okay. There's another story that I wanted to tell in relation to this whole issue of where we stand in the universe and the perspective that spaceflight provides. In high school, I was taking once a course on 20th century American literature. The teacher, it was a high school class, it was a high school teacher, began the course by giving a talk on the 20th century view of the world. And in that talk, he went back to the Ptolemaic picture of the universe, the one in which the Earth was at the center and the sun and everything else moved around it. And he emphasized that that's no longer the view, right? That view had placed all of the focus on human beings, right? That human beings saw themselves as distinctively created in the image of God, and human beings saw themselves naturally placed at the center of everything, right? And a lot of literature tended to stress or exalt, the role, the preeminence of humanity, the human race, partly because of its singular relationship with God, something that was more special than the relationship of any other species, right, to God, that we were the summit of creation and, again, placed at the center of existence. And the teacher went on to say that the 20th century view displaces us from that position of centrality, right? That sense of being, that position of being the focus of everything. And he drew a picture of, the sun and the Earth in its orbit around the sun. And he emphasized that this displacement from the center of things was something that we also saw in the arts, in literature, where instead of focusing upon individuals of preeminence, of greatness, nobility, kings, like lots of the main characters in Shakespearean plays are nobility, are kings, are queens, are people of great prominence, right? The more modern, sort of approach, tendency in literature is to focus upon the the less prominent, the more ordinary, the life of, the non-celebrated, the life of ordinary human beings, right? And the idea was that this focus upon the less preeminent corresponded to a displacement of humanity from the center to the periphery, off-center, okay? And so everything, in the mind of this teacher was converging upon this idea where we are not so special. And literature recognizes it, and science recognizes it. Well, I raised my hand and I said, that view that you've just presented is the 17th century view, the 18th century view, the 19th century view, but not the 20th century view, not the modern view. That the modern view, as I've said a number of times, is the Einsteinian view. And the Einsteinian view is that wherever you are at rest. That is, again, the nature of existence, that we cannot see the world from the outside to know that we are in motion relative to some fixed point, some fixed object, or fixed background of space, okay? So I went on to stress that from the Einsteinian perspective, each of us is the still center, and wherever you are is the still center. So restoring, actually, a sense of human dignity and significance. So it's a dignity and a significance that everything shares in, right? Because every object, wherever it is positioned, is at rest at the center of the world. Well, he did not take kindly to that. And after a little bit of my explanation, he said, okay, would you like to stop talking, or would you like me to insult you? It's hard to imagine, a teacher had never said, I'd never heard a teacher say something like that before. But he was obviously, he was embracing a view that he thought, was unassailable, right? But not so. Turns out that I had a teacher that I was friends with who was soon to become a leading administrator in the school district. I would visit his house. He had a background in history. He would give me sort of like college level history books that just expanded, my awareness of a whole realm, that I hadn't had a lot of exposure to. And I would have lunch with him, during various times. Well, after this class, I went to have lunch with this teacher, and I told the teacher what had happened. Well, the teacher, again, was prominent in the school, and the next day apparently went to the principal and explained what had happened in that classroom during the course of this discussion of the modern view, of the world, of the solar system. And the principal called in that teacher that had made that comment to me, and apparently was very harsh to the teacher, to the point where from that point on, that teacher kind of left me alone. Didn't, there was very little sort of interaction, which was kind of decisive in terms of my literary development, in that it was at that time in that class that I was developing that aphoristic style of writing that is the form in which I write philosophy, that highly concentrated form, almost like a form of verbal mathematics. The riddle of the world is an object. God is a skeptic, generating time, highly concentrated expressions. In fact, at one point, towards the end of this class, this course, we were going over a paper I had written, and the teacher made the comment, it's as if after every sentence, you're ready to go off on vacation. And the point was, yes, that I wanted every sentence to be complete in itself so that, in principle, I could write a paper in one sentence. I never quite achieved that degree of concentration, but that was the direction of my aesthetics. And that probably would not have happened, if that teacher had not left me alone to develop, that style, because he was, from that point on, almost afraid to be too aggressive, right, with me. So again, we see how one thing leads to another in unexpected, directions, unexpected developments. Okay. One of the most important things that human spaceflight is affording us is a perspective, right? We are seeing things from a great height, a great distance, right? We're seeing the Earth from a great distance, or we're seeing, whatever we might be exploring. It's giving us a new vantage point. And in general, when you see something from a great distance, a great height, and you look down on it, you can see patterns. You can see relationships that are not evident when you are immersed in something, right? That's why we seek height, a position of elevation, in order to get a sense of the landscape, right? The lay of the land. Well, one of the particular reasons why it's so valuable scientifically is when we see things from a distance, as we move away from things, the detail begins to recede. We lose detail, and we only see certain broad patterns or aspects, right? Well, that's the nature of scientific modeling itself. A scientific model leaves out a lot of details to get an overall sense of pattern, right? That allows for prediction. One of the reasons why astronomy was the first main science to develop is that when we look at, let's say, the stars or the planets, we're not seeing any detail, right? We're not seeing the details of a flaming star, or we're not seeing all the specific details of the surface of Mars as we're viewing Mars from the Earth, or as we're viewing Venus or Jupiter, right? We're just seeing points almost, right? So that loss of detail allows us to discern the patterns that, for example, made Kepler's laws possible to be elaborated, and that made Newton's work to be elaborated. If it were a matter of developing physics from, let's say, the Earth, given the complexity of our experience, we might never have achieved that degree of simplification, right? So, and there's an aphorism, science, that I've written, science simplifies. Simplicity is predictive. We see patterns, right? When you get to the quantum mechanical level, you can't predict anymore. There's too much complexity. You're seeing things too close up, right? So you need to back away in order to see pattern, to gain the perspective of pattern, right? That science is interested in articulating, right? But we're losing the detail, right? That's the trade-off we make. Every scientific model is something that is abstracted from an enormous complexity of detail that we otherwise will have trouble finding patterns within. So, how does that cohere with issues of philosophical perspective? I mean, philosophy is interested in seeing things from a distance, seeing everything sort of in relationship, to everything else. The difference between that scientific type of perspective, that seeing things from a distance affords, that seeing the Earth from orbit affords, and the perspective that philosophy is seeking and embracing is that philosophy will leave out none of the details, right? Science almost embraces the loss of detail because it allows patterns to emerge. Philosophy is aware, open to patterns, but even more will not allow any of the detail to be lost. It's that notion that it's an aphorism that I wrote at the end of my first book, actually. As of the sparrow, everything matters. Philosophically, everything matters. It's the nature of rigor. It's one of the reasons why science does not quite rise to the level of rigor that philosophy demands. And ultimately, one could argue, it's why, in a sense, science doesn't save us in the way that the religions aspire to, and philosophy rigorously can. That's one of the main points I've been stressing. It's interesting that the landing human beings on the moon, right, in 1969 was as great a technological achievement as humanity has produced. It was an age-long dream, of human beings, of novelists, of scientists, to be able to accomplish that seemingly unimaginable goal, right? Again, a goal ultimately that was made possible not by anything that Einstein did, but by everything that Newton did. But it's been noted, right, often that after some number of trips to the moon, we stopped going. Humanity has not been back to the moon with human beings in over 40 years, right? One might have thought in advance of that accomplishment that it would have been the beginning of vigorous exploration and development of the moon and beyond, but no, it didn't happen. And actually, interest in subsequent lunar missions after Apollo 11 dropped off rapidly. People just lost interest. And when interest was lost, there wasn't a lot of motivation for funding, right? So stopped going. Why did we stop going exactly? Well, it could be argued that it didn't decisively change enough. It didn't save us. That degree, that the magnitude of that accomplishment at the apex of human technological achievement didn't fundamentally change human life. didn't change it in the way that religions in their aspirations seek to fundamentally change an individual's relationship to the world, to save that person, right? To solve all the pressing issues. Fundamentally, as great an accomplishment as it was, it left things fundamentally the same. So, something to keep in mind, and the deep aspect of that is that going to the moon is not leaving ourselves behind, right? When we go to the moon or go into space or go to Mars, it is we that are experiencing the world from those perspectives, from those places, right? And the problems that need to be resolved, the fundamental problems of existence that need to be addressed, pertain here, right where I am, in this room, as much as they pertain at the distant edge of the galaxy or at the further end of the universe. Wherever we go, we bring ourselves with us, and we experience the world through human eyes. And the issues that have to be addressed are the same issues ultimately that have to be addressed decisively here. So wherever we go, we bring ourselves, and the fundamental problems remain. Now, one of the major interests these days is in exploring Mars. Elon Musk, the industrialist, the technologist, is now the wealthiest man, certainly in the United States, one of the wealthiest on Earth. He said that his wealth is not for him to indulge himself, it's to facilitate his interest in terraforming Mars, in turning Mars into something habitable. It's a not unreasonable dream or goal or aspiration, but if we have the capability now or at some future point to transform Mars into something livable for human beings, well, we would have the capability now or at some point to transform Earth into Eden. I mean, the human beings, like every other living thing on Earth, are adapted to very narrow conditions of temperature and pressure and all kinds of physical parameters. And so we will do better here than anywhere else. We have the capability of flourishing on Mars. We have the capability of making this a flourishing environment. So, okay, I think it is now time to address questions from last time, and let me do that. I'm going to look at these questions exactly, and actually, there's going to be something I want to read in relation to one of these questions too. Okay. So, first question, what should be the goal of humanity? Well, a few things about the question. I've emphasized that from a philosophical standpoint, rigor is all that matters, right? Rigor is philosophy, and rigor takes into account everything, right? It takes into account the fact that we exist in difference from everything else, that our differences between every other object, every other person, are the ultimate basis of our dignity, the ultimate basis of the singularity that allows us to escape any sense of general doom that we might have ascribed to other people in other circumstances. So I pull back from prescribing general goals for humanity. What I do emphasize is the importance of achieving understanding of the rigor of your circumstance, the nature of your circumstance, to move beyond all types of presumptions and unjustifiable claims that you make about the world, that you make about yourself, to come to terms with the philosophic, rigorous truth of your circumstance, of your distinctiveness, and what that means, that you are different from everything else, and that you don't yet know what the future will hold for you. And so you don't yet know what your nature is. Your nature reveals itself, over time in the course of your actions, your efforts, your choices. But my general guideline is understand the nature of rigor, understand what you can legitimately claim, understand the nature of your circumstances, and then act. Act as your nature inclines you to act, as only you can know and as only you can decide. So again, I pull back from giving general accounts of goals for humanity and instead focus upon the importance of achieving philosophic understanding, the understanding of one's true circumstance, the conditions of existence, and then acting with an understanding of those conditions consonant with whatever your specific nature and circumstance happens to be. Okay? Now, other question. Are you all destined to suffer from loneliness, or can we thrive being lonely? Okay. When it comes to some of our basic emotions, many can be understood, really, ultimately, all can be understood in terms of what has facilitated our survival as a species. That's the evolutionary biological perspective. I am very sympathetic to that view. We are social creatures, right? In the sense that our main advantage in terms of our ability to survive in the world is our ability to survive as groups. Our technologies, our ability to achieve spaceflight is a group achievement, right? It's not anything that could have been done by one person. Not even Newton was capable of writing the Principia himself. He needed the guidance and the help and the inspiration of a Halley, right? So collective enterprise is essential, to our survival and our flourishing. Language facilitates that. One of our most distinctive characteristics is our linguistic ability, and that linguistic ability exists ultimately to coordinate social engagement, to make it possible for us to coordinate actions with others, cooperate, achieve, goals through common enterprise. So we, as human beings, we were born helpless, right? We cannot survive as babies or as infants on our own. We need the love and care and support of other people, right? Parents. So there is survival value in emotions such as love, that allows us to pair bond and allows us to maintain a commitment to a baby, a child, to allow it to develop, into an adult that can, be self-sufficient. But still, these emotions that draw us to other people have been key to our flourishing as a species. That doesn't mean, though, that we are hardwired for certain requirements, right? Again, our nature is something that reveals itself. It's not something that we can see from the outside of the world, right? As we tend to think we do. So, can we be happy in singularity, right? Can we sort of embrace just our circumstance? Well, there's a Buddhist poem about that. It's a famous poem from the early Buddhist tradition, and it's a long poem. I'm not going to read or recite that much of it, just a short opening. The title of the poem is "Fair Lonely as Rhinoceros." Okay, I suppose rhinoceri are singular creatures in the way that squirrels, tend to be singular creatures as tree squirrels. Well, here's this poem. It's actually part of a religious text, a sutra in Buddhism. Put by the rod for all that lives, nor harm thou any one thereof. Long not for son, how then for friend? Fare lonely as rhinoceros. Love cometh from companionship. In wake of love, upsurges ill. Seeing the bane that comes of love, fare lonely as rhinoceros. Now, we've talked about the Buddhist tradition of seeking to overcome suffering, dukkha, the sense of life being awry, by overcoming one's attachment to things, to overcoming one's desire. And prominent among those desires, as this poem is sort of directed towards, is our desire to be with other people. Now, you can say, well, but wait, if we're going to be faring lonely as rhinoceros, then isn't that going to bring an end to the species? If we're not going to be pairing, and if we're not going to be, like in family units, if we're not going to be marrying or having children, as this suggests. And in fact, that is the Buddhist orientation, that Buddhism sees life as dukkha and wants to escape the wheel, wants to escape attachment, to end the cycle of birth after birth after birth. Remember, in Buddhism, transmigration is not seen as a solace, as a consolation. It's as a solution. It's seen as the problem. So it wants to escape that endless cycle, of rebirth. And to do that, it wants to overcome desire. And that includes the types of desires associated with being with others, right? It's so in a sense, yes, Buddhism is interested in putting an end to this, okay? In the way that the 19th century philosopher Schopenhauer was an advocate, also influenced by Eastern thought, less Buddhism, I think, than Hindu thought of various types. But Schopenhauer had a pessimistic view of human life, saw it as sorrowful, as filled with suffering. He was writing during and after the Napoleonic Wars that were very disruptive to Europe, produced a lot of suffering. And he actually advocated for people to stop reproducing. You know, his idea being that if the human race could stop reproducing for one generation, we could bring the human race to an end, and that would be a good thing, because it would end suffering in the way that Buddhism aspires to end suffering. Well, that's not my philosophical perspective. For one thing, I don't make such types of general claims, even about issues of loneliness. But, you know, what's often in the back of our mind is that God is imagined to be singular, right? So the idea of being able to be singular is something that actually is facilitatable, is achievable, depending upon the nature of one's mission, right? And this goes back to the idea of understanding the nature of one's circumstances and then acting in accord with whatever one's nature happens to be, right? As one might discover in the course of experience. Someone like Newton, who lived a solitary life, not seemingly lonely, alone largely, but not lonely, was focused on a mission, right? He wanted to understand, you know, God's design for the world. I've often had discussions with people about how one flourishes in an environment like Los Angeles, or actually in an environment like Harvard. And I've always maintained that one can do well in either place as long as one has a mission, a sense of purpose. And whatever, if that sense of purpose happens to be to some enterprise, some achievement of some type of understanding, as it was in the case of Newton, whatever that enterprise happens to be, an artistic enterprise, some type of creative enterprise, an entrepreneurial enterprise, then that can become, you know, a sufficient justification, you know, for one's life, that one does not feel lonely, even if one's alone, that being alone can be a condition of pursuing those kinds of goals. But again, it's highly singular, and I don't, you know, generalize, you know, when it comes to, you know, human beings, their fundamental interests and orientations. But it's it reminds me of again a comment by Mother Teresa that I've quoted before. It was always and only between me and God. That even though she spent her life working with others to help others, she saw herself as a singular type of force that was doing what she did in relation to God, not fundamentally in relation to other people, and wasn't expecting anything from other people. It was her relationship with God that was sustaining her, which is to say, her mission. So the mission can infuse one's life with sufficient meaning. Now, that's not to say that one has to be isolated, right? That one can, but if one has that sense of mission or purpose in some direction, then that can be the stabilizing axis, you know, of one's life, and then one won't feel a desperate need, for certain types of relationships. So yes, I think it is possible. And actually, one person that did make a statement that just came to my mind in relation to that, and he's somebody that I'm going to be talking about because his anniversary is coming up, is Napoleon. Napoleon once said that he was asked about his interest in a romantic relationship, and this was like later in his life. And he said, when I was young, when I was in my 20s, I could put the entire universe to one side and focus upon one person, Josephine. But now that I'm older and more mature, the idea of having one person be such a focus and the whole world, put to one side because of that was something that he couldn't entertain any longer. So I think the main, I think takeaway, from the philosophical perspective, I've been providing is that circumstances are singular and there's no reason to feel that one is constrained by whatever, one might have been experiencing in the past or what one might see other people doing. That given the nature of one's mission, one's purpose, one's sense of one's circumstance, anything is possible, including a singular life as Buddhism was prescribing. Okay? Okay.
Super.
So,
Okay.
I guess, are we... Oh, I guess we're just about out of time, aren't we? Do we have any questions tonight for next time?
Tonight we don't have any questions.
No questions.
No questions for today.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, our time is up, but we would like to thank one more time the U.S. Consul General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty team. And thank you very much, Stephen, for holding this event, for having these amazing talks and dedicating your talks to the current topic. And thank you, audience, for participating, for your comments that you always give us after the philosophical talks and during the philosophical talks. So we will be very glad to see you all next week. Please stay safe and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, hope to see you all next week. Thank you. Thank you, Aaliyah.
Thank you and have a great week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.